The morning sun cast long shadows across the shooting range as Harold, Hank, pulled his weathered pickup truck into the gravel parking lot. At 78 years old, his movements were deliberate but steady as he climbed out of the driver's seat, his joints protesting the early hour. The familiar weight of his rifle case felt reassuring in his weathered hands as he made his way toward the registration table. The annual state championship shooting competition drew marksmen from across the region, but this year felt different. Younger faces dominated the crowd, their expensive equipment gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the pavilion. Hank's eyes swept over the modern rifles with their sophisticated scopes, adjustable stocks, and precision-engineered barrels that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Behind the registration table sat Tommy, a competitive shooter in his 30s who had won several regional titles. His gaze fell on Hank's battered rifle case with barely concealed amusement. The case itself told a story of decades of use, with worn leather corners and faded military markings that spoke of another era. "Well, well," Tommy said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Looks like we've got ourselves a museum piece today, folks." His comment drew chuckles from several nearby competitors, all sporting the latest in precision shooting technology. Hank signed his name on the registration form without looking up, his handwriting still firm despite his age. He had faced worse than mockery in his lifetime, much worse. The sounds of laughter and whispered comments about old-timers and antique rifles barely registered as he focused on the task ahead. A local gun shop owner who had been dominating regional competitions for the past 5 years approached the registration table with his custom-built rifle worth nearly $15,000. He glanced at Hank's case and shook his head with a patronizing smile. "Hey, old-timer," called out, drawing more attention. "You sure you're in the right place? The historical reenactment is probably down the road somewhere." The comment sparked another wave of laughter from the younger shooters. Hank finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting's gaze directly. There was something in those eyes that made smirk falter slightly, a depth that spoke of experiences beyond the shooting range. "I'm exactly where I need to be, son," Hank replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Sarah, the range master and competition organizer, stepped forward with a welcoming smile. At 55, she had been running shooting competitions for over 2 decades and had learned to read people well. Something about the old man's quiet confidence intrigued her. "Mr. Welcome to our championship," she said warmly, checking his credentials. "I see you've registered for the precision long-range category. That's quite competitive this year." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Hank replied, tipping his weathered baseball cap slightly. The cap bore the faded insignia of the 1st Infantry Division, though few in the crowd would recognize its significance. As Hank made his way to the preparation area, conversations quieted momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. The contrast was stark. Where other competitors unpacked rifles that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, Hank opened his case to reveal what appeared to be a relic from another time. The rifle was an M1, the standard infantry weapon of American forces during World War II. Its wood stock showed the patina of age and careful maintenance, while the metal components bore the subtle wear marks of extensive use. To the untrained eye, it looked like something that belonged in a museum rather than a competitive shooting event. David, a young engineering student and rising star in competitive shooting, couldn't contain his disbelief. "Is that thing even legal for competition?" he asked loudly, pointing at Hank's rifle. "I mean, shouldn't it be behind glass somewhere?" The current record holder for the precision long-range category, James Bull, Sarah's younger brother, had been watching the scene unfold with growing amusement. His record of hitting a target at 800 yards with a group measuring just 2.3 inches had stood unchallenged for 6 years, and he saw no threat from the elderly veteran with the antique rifle. "Let me guess," Bull said, approaching Hank's station with his usual swagger. "That belonged to your granddaddy or something, probably hasn't been fired since the war ended." His custom rifle, a precision instrument worth more than many cars, rested casually in his arms. Hank continued his methodical preparation, checking each component of his rifle with practiced efficiency. His hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that comes from decades of repetition, every motion purposeful and precise. "Something like that," he replied without looking up. The mockery continued as more competitors gathered around. drawn by the spectacle of an old man preparing what they considered an obsolete weapon. Cell phones came out as several young shooters began taking photos and videos, already planning social media posts about the crazy old guy who showed up to a modern competition with a museum piece. "I've got to see this," laughed Jennifer, a professional instructor who had been competing for 8 years. "When that thing jams on the first shot, I'm going to need the video evidence." What none of the mockers noticed was the way Hank handled his rifle. His movements weren't those of a nostalgic old man playing with military surplus. Every gesture spoke of deep familiarity, of countless hours spent with this specific weapon. The way he checked the action, examined the sights, and tested the trigger pull revealed an expertise that transcended mere hobby shooting. As the morning progressed and competitors began their practice rounds, the sounds of modern rifles filled the air. Precise, muffled reports from suppressed barrels and the mechanical cycling of sophisticated actions created a symphony of contemporary marksmanship. Against this backdrop, Hank's preparation seemed almost quaint. The betting had already started among the younger competitors. Who would be eliminated first? How many shots would it take for the old man's rifle to malfunction? The consensus was clear. This would be over quickly, and Hank would learn that sentiment and nostalgia had no place in serious competition. What they didn't know was that Hank had a story that stretched far beyond the shooting range, a story that began on the beaches of Normandy and continued through some of the fiercest fighting of World War II. His rifle wasn't just a nostalgic keepsake. It was a trusted companion that had never let him down when his life depended on it. As the morning wore on and the competition preparation continued, Hank remained focused on his own routine, ignoring the increasingly bold comments and barely concealed laughter from his fellow competitors. He had faced skepticism before, along with much more dangerous opposition, and he knew that actions would speak louder than any words he might offer in response. The stage was set for what many expected to be a quick demonstration of why modern technology had rendered old weapons obsolete. But Hank carried with him decades of experience, and a weapon that had been tested under conditions far more demanding than any shooting competition could provide. The preliminary rounds began at 10 o'clock sharp, with competitors divided into groups based on their equipment classifications. Despite the organizers' attempts to maintain professional decorum, whispered conversations and pointed stares continued to follow Hank as he made his way to the 300-yard line for the first stage of competition. Had positioned himself at the station next to Hank's, his expensive rifle mounted on a precision rest that cost more than most people spent on their entire setup. The contrast was impossible to ignore. His equipment looked like it belonged in a military research facility, while Hank's appeared to have walked out of a 1940s battlefield. "You know, old-timer," said as they prepared for the first string of fire, "there's no shame in admitting you're outclassed here. These competitions aren't like the old days when everyone used iron sights and crossed their fingers." Hank adjusted his sling with practiced efficiency, settling into a prone position that spoke of military training from an era when precision shooting meant the difference between life and death. His body alignment was textbook perfect, acquired through training that emphasized fundamentals over technological assistance. "Iron sights served me well enough in Normandy," Hank replied quietly, his voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that made pause. Something in the way the old man spoke suggested this wasn't just casual conversation about military history. The range officer called for preparation, and competitors began settling into their positions. The modern shooters made countless adjustments to their equipment. Scope turrets clicked as they dialed in precise measurements, bipods were positioned and repositioned, and electronic devices calculated wind speed and atmospheric conditions. Hank's preparation was markedly different. He simply settled into his shooting position, made a few minor adjustments to his sling tension, and waited. His breathing became deep and regular, his body relaxing into the familiar stance he had used countless times under circumstances far more stressful than any competition. David, shooting 2 positions down, couldn't resist another comment. "Hey everyone, check this out," he called, loud enough for half the firing line to hear. "Grandpa's using iron sights. What's next, black powder and musket balls?" The laughter that followed was cut short by the range officer's command for silence, but the damage was done. Social media posts were already being composed in competitors' minds, with hashtags about vintage fails and reality checks, ready to be shared as soon as the inevitable disaster unfolded. What none of the mockers could see was the transformation occurring in Hank. As he settled behind his rifle, decades melted away. The comfortable shooting range with its covered positions and marked distances faded, replaced by memories of muddy foxholes and desperate defensive positions where missing your target meant your squad didn't make it home. The command to commence firing echoed across the range, and the symphony of modern marksmanship began. Suppressed rifles whispered their precision shots, while electronic chronographs measured velocities down to the single digit. Spotting scopes tracked bullet impacts with mathematical precision, and competitors made micro-adjustments based on ballistic computers that could account for variables their grandfathers never dreamed of measuring. Hank's first shot rang out with the distinctive bark of an M1, a sound that seemed almost primitive compared to the sophisticated whispers of his competitors' weapons. The brass case ejected with the characteristic ping that had once been the signature sound of American infantry advancing across Europe. Glanced over with barely concealed amusement, expecting to see Hank struggling to locate his impact through his basic iron sights. Instead, he saw the old man working his bolt with smooth efficiency, his body language suggesting complete confidence in his shot placement. The first stage required 5 shots at a standard target, with scoring based on proximity to the center. As competitors finished their strings of fire, spotting scopes revealed the results. Had shot a respectable group, though not his best effort. David had struggled with wind conditions, and several other shooters had produced groups that reflected the difficulty of precision shooting even with modern equipment. When the range went cold and competitors moved forward to score their targets, the whispered comments began immediately. Several young shooters had their phones ready to document Hank's presumed failure, planning to share the moment when reality confronted nostalgia. Sarah, the range master, reached Hank's target first and stopped dead in her tracks. Her expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine surprise as she examined the bullet holes. Bull, her brother and current record holder, noticed her reaction and jogged over to see what had caught her attention. "What we got, sis?" Bull asked, then fell silent as he saw the target. 5 bullet holes formed a tight cluster that would have been impressive with any rifle, but with iron sights and a 78-year-old rifle, it was nothing short of remarkable. The group measured just under 2 inches at 300 yards, a performance that put Hank in the top tier of competitors for this stage. More importantly, it was achieved with equipment that predated the birth of most other competitors by several decades. Arrived at the target just as Sarah was calling out the score. His smirk faded as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. The old man with the museum piece had just outshot half the field, including several competitors with equipment worth more than luxury cars. "Must be beginner's luck," muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could recognize that the kind of precision Hank had demonstrated didn't happen by accident. Word of Hank's performance spread quickly through the competitor gathering area. The easy mockery of the morning began to give way to puzzled respect, though many still maintained that the longer ranges would expose the limitations of outdated equipment. Tommy, who had initially dismissed Hank's entry, found himself his assumptions. "Okay, that was actually pretty impressive," he admitted to his shooting partner. "But wait until we get to 600 yards. That's where modern optics really make the difference." As competitors prepared for the second stage, the atmosphere around Hank began to shift subtly. The outright mockery decreased, replaced by curious glances and whispered speculations. Some began to wonder if there might be more to the quiet old man than they had initially assumed. Hank himself seemed unchanged by the attention. He went through his preparation routine with the same methodical precision, checking his ammunition, adjusting his position, and settling into the shooting stance that had become second nature over the course of his long life. Jennifer, the professional instructor who had earlier joked about mechanical failures, found herself studying Hank's technique with professional interest. His form was flawless, refined by an era when marksmanship training emphasized fundamentals over technological compensations. "I've got to admit," she said to her shooting partner, "his position is absolutely textbook. You don't see that kind of classical form much anymore." The second stage would be shot at 600 yards, a distance where even minor equipment deficiencies could result in significant disadvantages. This was the range where many expected Hank's good fortune to run out, where the limitations of iron sights and vintage ammunition would finally assert themselves against modern precision. But as Hank prepared for the longer distance, those who knew how to read the signs of an experienced marksman began to notice details they had missed earlier. The way he read wind conditions without instruments, the unconscious adjustments he made based on decades of experience, and most importantly, the absolute confidence with which he approached each shot. The stage was set for the next phase of what was becoming less of a competition between man and machine, and more of a demonstration of something that couldn't be purchased at any price. The kind of expertise that could only be earned through experiences that most of these modern competitors couldn't even imagine. The 600-yard line presented a different challenge entirely. At this distance, atmospheric conditions became critical factors, and even experienced shooters with advanced equipment struggled to maintain consistency. The wind had picked up since morning, creating variable conditions that would test everyone's abilities. Modern competitors began their elaborate ritual of technological consultation. Wind meters emerged from cases, ballistic calculators hummed with complex algorithms, and scopes were adjusted with precise clicks that represented mathematical calculations refined by computer software. The preparation time stretched as shooters consulted their equipment like pilots running through pre-flight checklists. Hank's approach remained unchanged from the shorter distance. He settled into his position with the same deliberate calm, but those watching closely could see him reading the environment in ways that predated modern instruments. His eyes tracked the movement of grass and leaves at various distances, noting how wind patterns shifted across the range. Had positioned himself to watch Hank's performance, convinced that this longer distance would expose the fundamental limitations of outdated equipment. "This is where reality sets in," he told David confidently. "You can't fight physics with nostalgia." Bull, the current record holder, was beginning to feel a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine competition. His first stage performance had been solid but not spectacular, and the quiet confidence of the elderly veteran was starting to create an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. "Sarah," Bull said to his sister as they prepared for the second stage, "what do you know about that old guy?" Sarah had been thinking the same thing. Hank's registration form listed previous shooting experience simply as military service, but his performance suggested something far more extensive than basic infantry training. "Not much," she admitted, "but I've been around shooters long enough to recognize when someone knows exactly what they're doing, and that man definitely knows what he's doing." The range officer called for preparation, and the line of competitors began settling into their positions. Electronic wind meters registered gusts varying between 8 and 12 miles per hour from the 2 o'clock position, conditions that would challenge even the most experienced marksmen. Hank's preparation seemed almost primitive compared to the high-tech routines surrounding him. He simply observed the wind indicators positioned at regular intervals down the range, made a few mental calculations based on decades of experience, and adjusted his hold accordingly. Jennifer found herself studying Hank's technique with growing professional fascination. "Look at how he's reading the wind," she whispered to her partner. "He's not using any instruments, but watch his eyes. He's tracking conditions all the way to the target." The command to commence firing cracked across the range, and once again the modern symphony began. Precision rifles whispered their expensive bullets downrange, while their operators made real-time adjustments based on electronic feedback and computer calculations. Hank's first shot at 600 yards rang out with the same authoritative bark that had characterized his shooting throughout the morning. The M1's distinctive report cut through the whispered sophistication of suppressed rifles like a voice from another era. What happened next began to shift the entire dynamic of the competition. Hank's shooting rhythm was different from his competitors, faster and more instinctive. Where others paused between shots to consult instruments and make calculations, he fired with a cadence that spoke of muscle memory developed under very different circumstances than sporting competition. Watching through his spotting scope, saw Hank's second bullet impact and felt his confidence beginning to waver. The shot placement was not just accurate, it showed a level of precision that shouldn't have been possible with iron sights at this distance. "That's impossible," muttered, adjusting his scope for a better look. Nobody shoots that well with iron sights at 600 yards. But the evidence was mounting with each shot. Hank's group was forming with mechanical consistency, each bullet finding the target with precision that rivaled the best modern equipment. More importantly, his shooting pace was significantly faster than competitors who relied on technological assistance. Tommy had stopped his own shooting to watch Hank's performance. "Either that guy is the luckiest man alive," he said to no one in particular, "or we're watching something special." David's earlier mockery had evaporated entirely. Through his spotting scope, he could see that Hank's group was not only tight but centered perfectly on the target. "How is he doing that?" David asked aloud. "I've got a scope worth $3,000 and I can barely see the target clearly at this distance." The answer lay in training and experience that none of the younger competitors could comprehend. Hank had learned to shoot at distances where missing meant fellow soldiers didn't come home. He had developed his skills in conditions where equipment failure meant death, and where split-second decisions under extreme stress separated survivors from casualties. As the string of fire concluded and competitors prepared to examine their targets, the atmosphere on the range had shifted dramatically. The easy confidence of the morning had given way to puzzled respect, and several shooters found themselves questioning assumptions they had held about the relationship between equipment and performance. Sarah reached Hank's target first, just as she had at the 300-yard line. This time, she wasn't alone. A small crowd of competitors had gathered, drawn by growing reports of the elderly veteran's unexpected performance. The silence that fell over the group spoke volumes. Hank's five-shot group at 600 yards measured just over 1.5 inches, a performance that would have been impressive with any equipment, but was simply stunning with a rifle that predated modern precision shooting by decades. Bull stared at the target in disbelief. His own best five-shot group at 600 yards, shot with a rifle specifically designed for precision competition, had never bettered 2 inches. The old man with the museum piece had just exceeded the performance of equipment worth 15 times more than his vintage rifle. "I don't understand," Bull said quietly, his usual swagger completely absent. "That shouldn't be possible." Hank had approached his target with the same quiet demeanor he had maintained throughout the competition. He examined the bullet holes with the eye of someone who understood exactly how they had gotten there, then simply nodded with satisfaction. "Nice shooting, mister," Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine respect. "That's exceptional marksmanship at any range with any equipment." "Thank you kindly," Hank replied, beginning to pack his rifle case with the same methodical care he had shown all morning. "She's always been reliable when I needed her." Approached with obvious reluctance, his earlier confidence replaced by confused respect. "I have to ask," he said, "where did you learn to shoot like that? That's not the kind of precision you pick up at weekend competitions." Hank paused in his packing, and for a moment his eyes took on a distant quality that suggested memories from far beyond the comfortable confines of the shooting range. "Different world back then," he said simply. "Different stakes." The implication hung in the air as competitors began preparing for the final stage of competition. The 800-yard challenge that would determine the ultimate champion had always been Bull's domain, the distance where his record had stood unchallenged for 6 years. But as the field moved to the final firing line, everyone understood that they were no longer watching a competition between modern technology and vintage equipment. They were witnessing a demonstration of something that couldn't be bought, downloaded, or learned from instruction manuals. The kind of expertise forged under conditions where second place meant you didn't survive to compete again. The final stage would reveal whether Hank's remarkable performance could be sustained at the distance where precision shooting became as much art as science, where even the most advanced equipment struggled against the fundamental challenges of long-range marksmanship. The 800-yard firing line represented the ultimate test of precision marksmanship. At this distance, the human eye could barely distinguish the target without optical assistance, and even minor variations in ammunition, atmospheric conditions, or shooting technique could result in complete misses. This was Bull's kingdom, where his record of 2.3 inches for a five-shot group had stood unchallenged for 6 years. The afternoon sun had shifted, creating different lighting conditions that added another variable to an already complex equation. Mirage began dancing off the heated ground between the firing line and the targets, creating visual distortions that could fool even experienced marksmen. Modern competitors began adjusting their high-powered scopes and consulting their ballistic computers for updated calculations. Word of Hank's extraordinary performance had spread throughout the range facility. Spectators who normally paid little attention to shooting competitions had gathered behind the 800-yard line, drawn by reports of something unprecedented happening. Range officials found themselves managing a crowd that had grown well beyond typical attendance. Bull's usual pre-shooting routine had become more elaborate than normal. The pressure of potentially losing his long-held record was showing in the extra time he spent checking and rechecking his equipment. His custom rifle, worth more than most people's cars, had never failed him in competition, but doubt was creeping into his mind for the first time in years. "I don't get it," Bull confided to his sister Sarah during preparation. "6 years nobody has even come close to my record. Now some old guy with a rifle from the history books is making my best shooting look average." Sarah had been thinking about the same thing, Hank's performance conventional wisdom about the relationship between equipment quality and shooting precision. "Maybe we've been looking at this wrong," she suggested. "Maybe it's not about the equipment at all." Hank's approach to the 800-yard challenge remained consistent with his behavior throughout the competition. While others frantically consulted instruments and made last-minute equipment adjustments, he simply studied the conditions with naked-eye observation that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. Had abandoned any pretense of focusing on his own shooting. His expensive rifle sat largely ignored as he watched Hank's preparation with the fascination of someone witnessing something he couldn't quite comprehend. "There's no way," muttered to anyone who would listen. "At 800 yards with iron sights, there's just no way." David had given up any hope of competitive shooting and had become a spectator to what was unfolding. His engineering background told him that Hank's performance should be impossible, but his eyes had seen the results at shorter ranges. "I'm starting to think we don't know as much about marksmanship as we thought we did," he admitted to Jennifer. Jennifer, the professional instructor, had been studying Hank's technique with growing amazement. "Look at his natural point of aim," she whispered to David. "He's not fighting his position or forcing anything. It's like the rifle knows exactly where to point." The range officer called for final preparation, and competitors began settling into their positions for the ultimate challenge. Electronic wind meters registered increasingly variable conditions, with gusts now reaching 15 miles per hour and shifting direction unpredictably. These were conditions that would challenge even the most advanced equipment. What none of the modern competitors understood was that Hank was drawing on experiences that transcended sporting competition. In his mind, he was no longer on a comfortable shooting range with marked distances and controlled conditions. He was back in the hedgerows of Normandy, where German snipers waited in concealed positions, and missing your target meant your squad took casualties. The memories flooded back as he settled behind his rifle. June 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day, when his squad had been pinned down by a German machine gun position that conventional weapons couldn't touch. The distance had been estimated at over 700 yards, well beyond the effective range of most infantry weapons. But Hank's M1 had been modified by a unit armorer who understood precision shooting. With carefully selected ammunition and iron sights adjusted to perfection, it had become a precision instrument capable of extraordinary accuracy in the right hands. Those hands belonged to a 22-year-old farm boy from Nebraska who had grown up hunting prairie dogs at distances other shooters considered impossible. The German machine gunner had been eliminated with a single shot that day, allowing Hank's squad to advance and complete their mission. That shot, fired under combat stress with lives depending on its accuracy, had been the beginning of a reputation that would carry Hank through some of the fiercest fighting in Europe. Now, 58 years later, the same rifle rested in the same hands, preparing for a challenge that was, by comparison, almost ridiculously simple. No enemy fire, no time pressure, no lives hanging in the balance. Just a paper target at a known distance under controlled conditions. The command to commence firing echoed across the range, and the final stage of competition began. Modern rifles whispered their precision shots, while computers calculated trajectory adjustments in real time. Electronic systems compensated for atmospheric conditions with mathematical precision that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations of marksmen. Hank's first shot at 800 yards thundered across the range with the same authoritative report that had characterized his shooting all day. But something was different this time. The rhythm was faster, more confident, as if the increased distance had triggered muscle memory from circumstances far more demanding than sporting competition. Through his spotting scope, Bull watched Hank's first bullet impact and felt his record slipping away. The shot placement was not just accurate, it was perfect, dead center in the target's highest scoring ring. "That's impossible," Bull whispered, but the evidence was undeniable. Hank's second shot followed within seconds, his bolt operation smooth and automatic. The brass case ejected with the distinctive ping that had once been the signature sound of American infantry advancing across Europe. Another perfect impact, placed with precision that every assumption about the limitations of vintage equipment. The crowd behind the firing line had grown quiet, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cell phone cameras recorded every shot, but the significance of what was happening went beyond social media documentation. This was a demonstration of human capability that transcended technological advancement. Had stopped pretending to compete and was openly starring at Hank's shooting. "He's not even taking time to aim," said in disbelief. "He's just pointing and shooting like it's the most natural thing in the world." But those who understood marksmanship could see that Hank was doing far more than simply pointing and shooting. His natural point of aim was perfect, his breathing controlled, his trigger control flawless. Every element of precision shooting was present, refined by decades of practice under conditions that had demanded nothing less than perfection. Hank's third, fourth, and fifth shots followed in rapid succession, each one finding the target with mechanical precision. The group he was forming at 800 yards was than most competitors could achieve at half that distance with the most advanced equipment available. As the string of fire concluded and competitors prepared to examine their targets, the silence on the range was profound. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come, a performance that challenged fundamental assumptions about marksmanship and the role of technology in precision shooting. The walk to the 800-yard targets felt like a pilgrimage to witnesses who had gathered throughout the afternoon. Bull's 6-year record was about to fall, but more importantly, a lesson was about to be taught about the difference between equipment and expertise, between technology and true mastery of the marksmanship arts. The walk to the 800-yard targets felt longer than usual, weighted with anticipation that had transformed what began as routine competition into something approaching legend. Sarah led the procession of competitors and spectators, her measuring tools ready to document what everyone suspected would be an extraordinary result. When she reached Hank's target, Sarah stopped so abruptly that Bull nearly collided with her. The silence that followed spoke louder than any announcement could have. 5 bullet holes formed a cluster so tight that for a moment, Sarah wondered if somehow fewer shots had been fired. "Measure it," Bull said quietly, his voice carrying the resignation of a champion who knew his reign was ending. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she positioned her precision calipers around the group. The measurement she recorded would be checked and rechecked by multiple officials, but the initial reading was unmistakable, 1.8 inches. Hank had not just broken Bull's 6-year-old record, he had shattered it by more than half an inch. "Ladies and," Sarah announced to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent range, "we have a new state record. Harold, shooting an M1 with iron sights, has achieved a 5-shot group measuring 1.8 inches at 800 yards. The explosion of noise that followed was unlike anything typically heard at shooting competitions. Applause mixed with excited conversations as spectators tried to process what they had witnessed. Cell phone cameras captured the target from every angle, documenting a moment that would be shared and reshared across social media platforms around the world. Bull approached Hank with genuine respect, his earlier swagger completely absent. "Mister," he said, extending his hand, "that's the finest shooting I've ever witnessed. I've held that record for 6 years, and you just made my best day look like amateur hour." Hank accepted the handshake with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the competition. "You're a fine marksman, son," he replied. "Different tools, same principles. Your record stood as long as it did for good reason." Found himself struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with his preconceptions about marksmanship and technology. His expensive rifle, with its precision barrel and advanced optics, had produced groups nearly twice the size of what Hank had achieved with equipment that predated the birth of most competitors. "I have to know," said, approaching Hank with obvious humility. "Where did you learn to shoot like that? That's not recreational marksmanship, that's something else entirely." Hank paused in his methodical packing of his rifle case, the same careful routine he had followed throughout the day. For the first time since the competition began, he seemed to consider sharing something beyond polite pleasantries. "Omaha Beach," he said simply, his voice taking on the distant quality that suggested memories from another lifetime. "Then the hedgerows, the Ardennes, all the way to Germany. Different kind of competition back then, much higher stakes." The implications of his words settled over the gathered competitors like a revelation. David, the young engineering student who had mocked Hank's equipment that morning, found himself speechless as he realized he had been in the presence of someone who had helped liberate Europe. Jennifer, the professional instructor, stepped forward with questions burning in her mind. "Mister, would you be willing to share some of your techniques? What you've demonstrated today goes beyond anything I've seen in decades of competitive shooting." Hank considered the request for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fundamentals never change," he said. "Sight alignment, breathing, trigger control, natural point of aim. The fancy equipment can help, but it can't replace understanding the basics. We didn't have computers or electronic gadgets. Had to learn to read wind, understand ballistics, know our equipment better than we knew ourselves." Tommy, who had started the day with jokes about museum pieces, now listened with the intensity of someone receiving wisdom from a master craftsman. "But the precision," he said. "At 800 yards with iron sights, how is that even possible?" "Practice," Hank replied matter-of-factly. "But more than that, understanding that every shot matters. In competition, you get to try again tomorrow. In war, you don't get second chances. That kind of pressure either breaks you or makes you better than you ever thought possible." As the afternoon drew to a close and competitors began packing their equipment, the conversation continued around Hank's shooting station. Young marksmen who had begun the day confident in the superiority of their modern equipment found themselves reconsidering fundamental assumptions about marksmanship. Sarah, as range master and competition organizer, had the responsibility of making the official announcement and presenting the championship award. But she found herself wondering how to adequately recognize what had just occurred. This was more than a shooting competition. It was a lesson in history, humility, and the enduring value of hard-earned expertise. "Mister," Sarah said as the formal ceremony concluded, "I hope you'll consider returning next year. I think a lot of people could learn from watching you shoot." Hank smiled for the first time that day, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed glimpses of the young soldier he had once been. "Maybe so," he replied. "Though I suspect some of these young folks might give me a better challenge once they understand that the equipment is just a tool. The real precision comes from up here," he tapped his temple, "and in here," he placed his hand over his heart. As Hank loaded his rifle case into his pickup truck and prepared to drive away from the shooting range, he left behind more than just a new record. He had provided a demonstration of something that couldn't be purchased, downloaded, or learned from instruction videos. The kind of mastery that could only be forged under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The young competitors who had mocked his equipment that morning now watched his departure with newfound respect, understanding that they had been in the presence of someone whose expertise transcended generational and technological boundaries. The rifle they had dismissed as a museum piece had proven to be a precision instrument in the hands of someone who understood that true marksmanship was about far more than having the most expensive equipment. Bull's record had stood for 6 years, but everyone present understood that Hank's achievement would be remembered long after new records were set and broken. They had witnessed something that connected the present to a heroic past, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories are won not with the technology, but with timeless principles applied by those who understand what it truly means to perform when everything depends on getting it right the first time. As the sun set over the range, the story of the veteran who silenced the doubters with a single, perfect performance began spreading beyond the shooting community, carrying with it lessons about respect, humility, and the enduring power of expertise earned through experience that most people could never imagine facing themselves.